Hi, I'm Dr. Kathy Bush.
And hello, I'm Dr. Tara Peters, and we'd like to welcome you to another segment of the Leadership Doctors. And today we have another really cool topic that we're going to talk to you about today and share with you.
Enjoy.
Well, thank you for tuning in to the Leadership Doctors. I'm Dr. Tara Peters, and this is my colleague.
Your favorite colleague.
Yes, my favorite colleague.
Dr. Kathy Bush.
And so, Kathy and I, we love each other. I hope that comes through as we are spending some time with you. And so we wanted to share with you in this particular segment about our book, The Demotivated Employee. And so it's been a labor of love that we have been able to bring forward. And we're excited to share with you about why we decided to talk about demotivation as opposed to motivation. So if you do a quick Amazon check, you will see thousands, literally,
Thousands.
Yes, of books about motivation. And in part because there's so much that's been published around motivation, we didn't think that we wanted to go down that path, but also because our experiences suggested to us in research that we were really asking the wrong question. It wasn't really about how we motivate employees, but rather how we stop demotivating them. And so really that became the inspiration for this book and why we decided to travel down this particular path of considering demotivation as opposed to motivation in the workplace.
So in our experiences talking to an awful lot of people, one of the major things that everybody's aware of when they talk about their workplaces, whether we're talking about colleagues, sometimes talking about our own work experience and feelings about work, and oftentimes when we talk to leaders who are considering what's going on in their group, no matter what, everybody's tuned into this idea of motivation. When motivation begins to slump, when people start feeling that sort of lack of motivation, that's when we're all very, very aware of it. And so, again, as Tara said, we're so tuned into the idea that motivation is the responsibility of the workplace and the leader has a major role to play. And we have lots of help thinking about that. But we really never ran into anything that helped us think about what causes highly motivated, well-intended, good people to lose motivation. And so that's the point of this book. And we hope you enjoy reading it and thinking about that along with us. The structure of the book has 5 sources of employee demotivation. One of those sources is something that people carry with them. We call it individual differences. And so it's the more internal source, right? And so it's the one that probably most of us default to. We say, well, you know, that dude's demotivated, but that's just who he is. He's that kind of person or whatever. And so that does contribute. We're not saying it doesn't. But the other 4 sources are actually things that happen in the environment around the employee who's demotivated. And in fact, the leader has a lot to do with it. And so the focus of the book really is to help you understand where these sources of demotivation come from. And your understanding ought to help you then know how to spot it when you're seeing it. And then secondly, to help you figure out as a leader what you can do when you see it happening, and better yet, what you can do to prevent it from happening.
There's a pretty clear relationship between demotivation in the workplace and employee engagement. And kind of to give you some context for this, so every year Gallup does a survey. It's called the Q12, and it's a 12-question survey around employee engagement. And employee engagement is really just discretionary effort, so that extra that employees will give that is subject to choices that they might make. And so what's interesting is that Gallup is doing this research for decades. And as Kathy and I were trying to better understand demotivation and what was happening, we really began to look at Gallup's employee engagement survey. And what we were finding based upon their research is really a crisis. And it's a $500 million crisis. Gallup has estimated that somewhere between $450 million and $550 million every single year is a cost that business is incurring in the US because employees are disengaged. And disengagement is a function of being demotivated. These people are checked out. They are, and some of them are not only checked out, but they're actually unhappy and busily acting out their unhappiness in terms of deviant behaviors. And all of this has a cost to the company in terms of lost productivity, turnover, employees not being fully committed to the work that they're doing, going through the motions. And so there's a cost, a $500 million cost that's attached to that. And to kind of think about this in context, there's a lot of discussion right now around student loan debt in the US. And to let you know what that sticker shock is for that $500 million, we could pay off all the student loan debt in the top 6 states that have debt outstanding, and we still have $22 million left. So this is the cost to companies because employees are not engaged at work. And so helping organizations to really understand that there's a consequence, and then not only understand that there's a consequence, but then help them to fix that is really important. It's really why we've written this book, because again, we want to help leaders to fix this particular crisis and to then use that to make some organizational impact in terms of outcomes.
So that's really striking information. And if you really think about the data that says to us 70% of workers, 70% are disengaged in the workplace. So just try to picture 70% of the people that are in your workspace right now. So, you've got 20 people, 14 of them are disengaged. Just if you got a little bit of improvement in that, how much more productivity would you get? So what's going on that's causing people to feel so disengaged? Now, again, our assertion is that this idea of demotivation is just something we're not paying enough attention to, and that if we could look at what's causing people to feel demotivated, we could tackle this issue of their disengagement and increase productivity, increase job satisfaction, and think for a minute about what people who are demotivated are like to work with. So the impact on the other people who may not be demotivated, but are hanging out with this guy who's in their demotivated funk, right? So there's an impact on other people. And then, of course, there's an impact on customers, right? You've been to places where you can tell the people who are serving you are demotivated. Do you want to hurry right back? Do you bring your friends? Probably not.
Right? Not so much.
So there are other costs and losses associated with demotivation that are really worthwhile for you to think about and to pay attention to. And hopefully it will inspire you to think, what can I do to solve that? What do I need to do differently as a leader? How do I change this pattern of demotivation in the workplace? So one of the things that we like to talk about when we talk about the idea of demotivation is this basket analogy. And we're going to show you what we mean by this. But just to get you to think about it, most of the theories of motivation, they start with this premise that people kind of come to work with an empty basket, and it's the job of the manager, the leader, to fill that basket up. And so we have things like incentives and bonuses and clear expectations and inspiration and other things that leaders are supposed to do that cause motivation in employees. So they're throwing things into the basket. And this premise we think is wrong. We believe that the premise should be rethought in terms of what really happens when people come to work. And so rather than telling you about it, Tara's going to demonstrate it for you.
So we believe that when employees come to work, that their basket is already full. Otherwise, why would they get out of bed in the mornings? Otherwise, why would they agree to take on the task or to join the organization? So we start from the premise that your basket is already full. And if you look in this basket, if you think about your own work, the chance to do something that's important, the chance to utilize your strengths and your talents, the opportunity to be heard, all of these cause your basket to be full. And notice, as Kathy said earlier, that they reside from within us. So it's not something that our manager has to drop into us. It's already present. But what happens, though, is that even though our baskets are already full, it is a fragile state, which means that it can be affected by things that other people do to us. So for example, when a manager doesn't recognize that we're dealing with stress in the workplace and doesn't look to help us with that, it can cause our demotivation our motivation to be lost. And so demotivation is creeping in. And so to kind of illustrate this, again, imagine that this is your basket, it's full. And then let's say that this is your innovation and your ability to create. And that really is a source of motivation for you. And imagine that something happens in the workplace that causes you not to be able to use your ability to innovate and create. What happens then is that a hole is poked. And it's going to cause you to actually lose that source of motivation, right? And this is what happens in the workplace when we're talking about demotivation, how that actually shows up in an employee and how that shows up in the workplace.
And sometimes it's just one hole in one little part of your basket, right? And so you might have enough other motivation that you're going to make that okay, right? And you'll get over that little source of demotivation. But sometimes we're just poking holes and we're poking holes. I'm not going to poke holes in all of them, but sometimes that process continues over and over again. And that's when, leaders can step in. Leaders can see that problem, can, if they are the problem, they can stop doing what they're doing, or they can help the employee. And so that's really where we see a major change in the way we think about this. So we talked about 5 sources of demotivation and began talking about the first one being individual differences, the one that is more internal to us. And if you think about individual differences, that's things like the differences in our personalities. And so some of us are naturally cheerful and bubbly, and everybody's like my good friend Tara. And I've been lucky to work with some people who you just have a smile on your face when you work with them. And other people are maybe a little bit more in the gloomy side, maybe in the Winnie the Pooh series, more the Eeyore personality type that might be a little grumpier. They haven't had enough coffee yet. Please don't talk to me, right? And some of those things are the differences. That doesn't mean, by the way, the Eeyore type's not motivated, but we do see differences in terms of the energy level and the approach that people have to work. So that's the first source. Second source?
The second source is stress. In the workplace. And I bet we all know something about stress. And so let me say, first of all, that we understand that stress, particularly for short periods of time, can actually be a motivator for us, right? So with this big deadline that's in front of us, right? So we pedal really hard and then we get to that deadline, but it's over and we're done with it. But when stress is for extended periods of time or it returns frequently, boy, that can really demotivate employees. And the impact of that really is not just in terms of their work, they're less productive, but also there's a health consequence to this as well, where we see employees having a loss of sleep, or they are taking absences or calling in to work sick. And so there's a mental health component to stress as well. And so we really talk about that in the context of the book around how stress contributes to demotivation in the workplace, and then causing managers to really attend to that and recognize that your people are hurting. Your people are actually struggling to deal with the fact that they are under-resourced, or dealing with the fact that there's a lot of projects that are coming to them and they are not sufficiently staffed, or whatever the roadblocks might be. And then having managers who say, okay, we recognize it, and maybe we can't change the business requirement here, but what can we do together to help to relieve some of the stress that you are actually facing? And so we think it's important that leaders actually attend to stress because of the impact that it has on employees and the broader organization. So Kathy, any more to add to that, or to talk about the third source?
Well, jumping into the third source, the idea that people sometimes are stressed by not fitting in with the organizational culture. And so that is our third source, the organizational culture and the mismatch. And so if you think about all the different kinds of organizations you've probably experienced in your work lives or even as customers, there are differences in sort of the personality and the attitude, the values and the vibe of a place, and sometimes the rules and the policies and the procedures. And so if you work in a place that has more of a family-like culture where everybody, feels like they support one another and they're a part of the family, and they have a very positive experience, it's more likely that you're going to have a motivation to be a member of that family, to contribute to that family. And also when you run into stress or other difficulties, you're going to feel like you can rebound more quickly because the people around you are supportive. And so that's a kind of culture, but there are other kinds of cultures. And so in our book, we examine a specific model, but there are lots of different ways to think about how cultures are different. So for example, by contrast, what if you worked in a place that's really very policy structure, rule oriented? That kind of a place would be different in terms of how it impacted your motivation. Now, you might actually love the structure and the rules and the predictability of all of that, and the lack of, let's say, risk taking that you might have because everything's laid out for you, in which case you'd be motivated. But if you're a person who wants to be heard, who wants to take a risk, who wants to do things differently, you might be more stressed out. You might actually think, oh my gosh, nobody's interested in my point of view. Why bother? And those would be the sources of your demotivation. And so that's a very different kind of culture. And sometimes we go into a job or a situation thinking we know what kind of culture we're going to have. And it's a very different kind of experience. And so that is the source of our demotivation. So that's our third category. We have two left. You want to talk about number 4?
I will talk about number 4. So the fourth source that we talk about in our book is actually conflict with coworkers. And so I bet you can imagine that in your experiences in the workplace, that there's been a coworker that you didn't exactly get along with very well. And so relationship conflict is really common in the workplace. Think about it. You're going to bring a group of people together. Different personalities, different interests, different backgrounds. And so sometimes that can lead to conflict. Conflict in and of itself is not a bad thing. Conflict can help us to get to better outcomes because we have differing viewpoints and we know how to navigate that successfully. Conflict can actually work to our benefit. But when conflict isn't navigated well, it can really be dysfunctional in nature and really have an adverse consequence in terms of how employees actually look to resolve it. And so we talk about conflict. We talk about the different types of conflict. There's a lot of research around that. And then we really try to help you to put yourself in those situations with some storytelling. And we really do that throughout the book so that you can make connections to the experiences that you hear us talking about and say, okay, I can relate to that. And I've seen something like that. And then we really try to put that in context and say, okay, here's how you might navigate that based upon, for example, a particular conflict style that you might be more predisposed to in terms of a preference, and then how you actually manage that. Because again, people are different inside of the workplace. And so this leads us to our 5th source.
Yeah, I'll tell you, conflict with coworkers is a rough one to overcome. Leaders can be a key to helping coworkers who are having a hard time working together. And leaders actually have a lot to do with all of the sources, even the first one that's more internal, the individual differences source. Leaders can help us kind of maximize our productivity given who we are. Leaders can help us with managing stress and debriefing and decompressing when we're in stressful situations. And of course, leaders have a lot to do with setting up the organizational culture. So I keep referring to leaders because our 5th category is specific to the behaviors of leaders and the failures of leaders, if you will, because we don't always do everything right as leaders. And so there's kind of a well-known saying, it's been repeated and rearranged a few ways, but it's essentially the idea, you've probably heard it, that people leave bosses, they don't leave companies. And so when you think about the major impact of demotivation, which might be turnover and people leaving, it's worthwhile to kind of recognize how important that relationship is with the boss. And so there are things that we actually identify 6 really specific failures. And just to give you an overview, there are things like the failure to provide effective feedback, or to the failure to engage people and get their opinions. And so these kinds of failures in leadership style and behavior can be the primary cause of somebody's demotivation. So again, these 5 sources are all areas worth paying attention to. It could be someone's demotivation has multiple sources. It could be that one source is really the major issue that is impacting the demotivation of your workers. And as you examine the book or get involved in a workshop with us, you'll begin to recognize how you can examine, diagnose, if you will, what's going on with your employees and their demotivation, so you know what to do to, again, to prevent it, or to do something that will fix the problem. So look forward to talking with you more about that, or sharing our ideas through the book.